So first of all, Professor Wendy Pullen is sitting in the middle here. She's a Professor of Architecture and Urban Studies in the Department of Architecture at the University of Cambridge. So Wendy brings an international and historical dimension to our panel. She's studied growth and change in many different cities across the world at different periods of time. So in a way that doesn't just look at planning policy, but also in a multidisciplinary way. So I think ties in many ways very well with the things that George has been talking about. Okay, I'd also like to introduce Tony Eva, who's sitting next to her. So Tony is an earth scientist, also at the University of Cambridge. He's co-founder of the Cambridge Climate Lecture Series, which he started in 2017. The theme of the recent 2018 events was Climate Change is Now. Some of you may have gone to some of the events, I think. What's special about these lectures is not just the quality of the guest speakers, they were excellent, I went to some of them, but also the emphasis of the lecture series on possible solutions and the actions that we all need to take. So not just looking at what somebody else says could happen, but thinking, what should we be doing about this? Okay, and then we've got James Littlewood, who's sitting next to Tony, and he's the Chief Executive of the local environmental charity Cambridge Past, Present and Future, CPPF. I think I see a lot of people here who are members of it. And for those who don't know, it's a charity that works to keep Cambridge and its surroundings special. They say on their website, by positively influencing planning developments, delivering environmental education and managing the green spaces and historic buildings in its care. And then we've got John Preston, who's spent his life involved in those kind of issues. Yeah? So, and I think that the Cambridge that we know now would not look the same without his work as the leader of Cambridge City Council's Historic Environment Conservation Team for many years. He's now Heritage Chair of the Sustainable Traditional Building Alliance, and I think that we all owe him a huge debt for his dedication to conservation and environment. So thank you, John. And finally, last but not least, because actually he's very important to us, is Stephen Kelly, who is the, he's in many ways, I mean, we're here this evening because we do care about the future of the city we live in. And Stephen Kelly, I'm afraid, is the man who has the heaviest responsibility for making Cambridge a green city. He's the Joint Director of Planning and Economic Development for Cambridge City Council and also South Cambs District Council. So I think he's the person that we will be looking to implement some of these ideas. Okay, so first of all, could I ask Tony to speak first?
Thank you and good evening. Human civilization's been around for about 10,000 years, so that's roughly 100 centuries. But of those centuries, the one that we're living through at the moment is the most extraordinary. If we look at the time between the birth of civilization and the birth of George Ferguson, arguably 99 centuries, then during that time, carbon dioxide in our atmosphere increased by 30 parts per million. Since George was born, it's increased by another 100 parts per million. Now, I don't mean to suggest that George is personally responsible for that, but it does serve to illustrate the completely unsustainable pathway that we're currently on. And were we to continue on anything like such a pathway, then students at the PERS, by the time they retire, they would be living in a world which was something like 3 to 4 degrees Celsius warmer than in pre-industrial times, and associated with that would be the drowning of our coastal cities, would be the breakdown of our global food supplies, and would be the mass migration of refugees on a scale which is pretty much unimaginable. But there's some good news. We know what to do about it. We have to make every city in the world carbon neutral by the middle of this century. Now that's an enormous challenge. and it's not going to be solved by climate scientists and engineers. Because the greatest obstacle to changing the world is not a lack of scientific knowledge or of technology. It's about having the imagination to be able to envisage a world which is radically different from our own. So we need the artists, we need the architects, we need the clowns. Relying on the Enlightenment's attitudes on its own is not going to be sufficient. We're going to have to embrace the new romanticism. So let's all join in imagining a Cambridge which could be a greener, cleaner and healthier city. And just in case you were wondering what Cambridge might look like, on one of George's special Sundays, I know that the Cambridge Commons is organising a car-free day on Saturday the 22nd of September, so please do support them as the petition that's circulating today. Thank you.
Right, so from Cambridge past, present and future's perspective, a green city is very much about green spaces and landscapes, as in vegetation and nature. And I think we need to do four things. Firstly, we need to recognise and protect the most valuable green spaces and landscapes. And this might sound obvious, but we don't really do it. We produce plans showing where development should go, but we should be producing plans that show the green landscapes and the green spaces that we want to protect and to create for future generations. Secondly, we need to connect our green spaces and their habitats to allow nature and people to move through them. This will help our green spaces be more resilient to changes such as climate, and it will also help improve people's health and well-being. And these connections also need to be protected. Thirdly, we need to make sure that these landscapes and green spaces offer nature and people. Much of our green belt is actually private farmland, which is very industrially farmed. We need to find ways for the economic growth of Cambridge to help us to achieve this change. Fourthly, it's not just about the macro, we also need to be thinking about the micro. So connecting green infrastructure within the city's fabric, our parks, our street trees, our green spaces, green rooms and gardens. So Cambridge past, present and future think the four most important landscapes which we should be protecting for future generations are shown in this sort of hand-drawn map here. The Gog Hills, which is the elevated land extending from Cherry Hinton chalk pits in the east to Nine Wells in the west and extending away from Cambridge along the Roman Road. Secondly, the River Cam Valley and its associated meadows, commons and tributaries. You all know Grantchester Meadows, Sheep's Green, Cofen, Midsummer, Stourbridge and Ditton, and extending north to Milton Country Park. To the northeast of the city are the Fenlands, extending from Fulbourn and Wilbraham Fens out to Wickham Fen as part of the National Trust Wickham Vision. And then fourthly, what's been called the quarter to six quadrant. So if you imagine Cambridge as a clock, the land that would be contained within the hands of the quarter to six. So in effect, the arc of land to the west of the city, which extends from Maddenley Hill in the northwest to Trumpington Meadows in the south. So I think that's our 2-minute vision for green Cambridge.
What I'd like to do is begin by thanking George and saying I think one of the most interesting things about your talk is that a city is made up of many different things. The diversity of a city is extraordinary, and we can begin by concentrating on green issues, and there's no question, as we've heard, why that's very important for us to concentrate on, but at the same time, we have to figure out how do all of the very important issues of a city come together. And I think you gave us a wonderful exposition of how you've been doing that in Bristol. So thank you very much. Now, in terms of Cambridge, as we've said, as George has said, Cambridge is not Bristol. Cambridge is a much smaller city. World-class in certain ways, yes, but it's a world-class university much more than a world-class city. And one of the things that we haven't worked out very well at this point is to what extent are we looking at the city and to what extent we're looking at the university and what is that relationship. And we know that at times it is a troubled relationship. Cambridge is a town that is struggling to become a city. That's a difficult thing to do. Cambridge is still small. one of the things that we hear over and over and over again in terms of what Cambridge needs, two things actually. One is housing, and the other is transport. And the number of times that this has come back to me, well, if we could only solve the transport and the housing, we'd have Cambridge as a city. And I would say, no, that won't do it. In fact, according to what George was saying tonight, and some of the disastrous results that we get in cities, these are cities where there only has been concentration on housing and transport. And what I would say is that one of the things that we really need to focus on is what is the city center, where do people come together, where are there public places, how do we bring up the density in the center of Cambridge without destroying some of the wonderful qualities of it. And that, of course, will have very strong green implications because it will take some of the pressure off of the green belt. So we need to concentrate much more on the center of Cambridge than we are doing at this point. And I hope that will be a direction that certainly the development will go in. Thank you.
Right, my main theme coming from this is how do you get a divided city to come together around a unified vision for the future? We're in a hothouse economically, which is fine. On the right there you see Anthony Carpen's diagram of all the different agencies involved just in terms of local government. We don't have a unified city in terms of local government. We don't have a unified city in terms of universities, colleges. There's no common overall body that brings them all together. Where they do have a vision is, yes, we must grow, and yes, we want more money from government to try and solve our transport problems. Ingredients for quality growth. The quality chart are now under review. To have those 4 ingredients you can see, community, connectivity, climate and character, there's something vital that's missing, and that's capacity. There's a very big issue now, and we're really seeing it with all the transport link issues, roadways, busways, cycleways such as the greenways, as Wendy's already highlighted, where we're trying to cram too many people into too small a space, risking irretrievable damage to open spaces. So what do we need to do? We need to try and find a way, where can we put all the extra cycles from the expansion that's already been approved, for instance? How do we unite around the vision? There was the visions of 2065, which was produced 3 years ago. It was due to go out for consultation, but there's 24 different visions. And locals care, developers grab and run. Who has actually benefited from all this? And what about affordable housing? So let's try and end on something positive. If we're looking back to the Bristol Green Partnership and bringing people together, there are so many seeds of change we've already got. You can see those I've listed there, but I was just noting down. People like food cycle. And just to end, I spent a lot of time doing environmental education, working in schools, doing exactly as George says, trying to get them interested. Is there a way of getting into the schools, getting them involved in the project, and really looking forward? Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. Having regard to George's reference to cartoon characters, the one that springs to mind when you talk about green is Shrek, one of my personal favourites and a philosopher who talks about layers. And I think the green issue or the green discussion is around layers in a city as wonderful as this, but also given the breadth of challenges that we face. And what I wanted to do just very briefly is try and tell a bit of a positive story. Others have contributed to, I'm sure, what will be a lively discussion. But to highlight that we've made, in my view, a good start recently. What we have in the discussion I'm bringing, I thought I'd just focus on green space, is we have, as we know, a city surrounded by greenbelt. This is the greenbelt in your city. We also have a whole suite of publicly accessible spaces that will be familiar to many of you. Some of them are civic spaces, some much smaller. And we have a huge number of private spaces to which people have some degree of access. These spaces are connected, but really importantly, these spaces have been added to significantly over the last 15 years. There are 257 hectares of public parks and gardens in Cambridge, and in the last 15 years, picking up on the point about agribusiness on much of the land around, the city has added 188 hectares of publicly accessible parks and spaces around the perimeter, in places that some of you will be familiar, whether it's Trumpington Meadows or not. Now that sounds to me like a good start. The major challenge is how do we connect those spaces together? How do we all take advantage of it for all of the reasons that George and others have highlighted about enlivening space and creating a city in which everybody can enjoy healthy lifestyles and activity. Thank you.